When my father invited the entire family to a formal dinner at the city's most prestigious restaurant, he made it sound like an important celebration. Business partners, old friends, and several influential guests would be there, and he insisted that everyone dress their best. "Don't embarrass me," he warned before hanging up. I arrived 10 minutes early, wearing a simple dark suit instead of the expensive designer brands my brother loved to show off. The hostess smiled warmly when she saw me, but I quietly asked her not to make a fuss. She nodded with a knowing smile and escorted me toward the private dining room. As soon as I entered, my father looked me up and down with obvious disappointment. "That's what you're wearing," he scoffed. My younger brother laughed and adjusted his luxury watch, while my mother avoided looking at me altogether. Dinner began with polite conversation about investments, promotions, and expensive vacations. Every time someone asked what I had been doing lately, my father answered before I could speak. "Nothing special," he said. "He waits tables. Not exactly a career worth talking about." Several guests gave me sympathetic smiles. I simply nodded and continued eating. I had learned years ago that arguing with my father in public only encouraged him to humiliate me even more. Halfway through the meal, one of the businessmen complimented the restaurant service. My father chuckled and pointed at me with his fork. My oldest son could probably teach the staff a thing or two. After all, he's just a poor trash waiter. The table erupted with uncomfortable laughter. My brother smirked, and my father leaned back proudly, convinced he had delivered the funniest joke of the evening. I quietly placed my napkin beside my plate and took a slow sip of water. The restaurant manager suddenly hurried into the room and whispered something to one of the servers. Within seconds, every employee in the dining room seemed to straighten their posture. The atmosphere changed as though someone important had just arrived. One of the distinguished guests frowned as he watched the staff. He looked from the manager to me, then back again. Finally, he turned toward my father with a puzzled expression and asked, "Excuse me, if your son is only a waiter?" The guest slowly stood, looked directly at me, and finished his question in a voice loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Then what's the owner of the restaurant doing serving dinner with us tonight?" A heavy silence settled over the room. My father laughed nervously. "I'm sorry, what did you just say?" The guest looked genuinely confused. I said, "Isn't he the owner?" Every eye turned toward me. The restaurant manager stepped forward before I could answer. "Yes, sir. He purchased the restaurant 3 years ago. And he's been personally involved in its operations ever since." My father's smile disappeared. "That's impossible." I calmly folded my hands. "It's true." My brother frowned. "You own this place?" I nodded. "And 2 others." The room fell completely silent. One of the investors leaned toward me. "I've heard this restaurant became one of the highest rated in the city after new ownership took over." I smiled. "We focused on treating both guests and employees with respect." The investor chuckled. "So, you really do wait tables?" "Sometimes." My father looked bewildered. "But, why?" "Because I like knowing what happens on the dining room floor. I meet customers. I train new staff. And I never want to forget what honest work feels like." The manager added. "He still works a service shift at least once a week. Not because he has to. Because he chooses to." My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I thought. I looked at him. "You thought serving people was something to be ashamed of." He lowered his eyes. "I suppose I did." One of the guests smiled. "My grandfather owned a hotel. He always said the best owners know every job in the building." I nodded. Mine said something similar. "If you aren't willing to do the work yourself, don't expect others to respect your leadership." The investor raised his glass. "That explains why your staff seems so loyal." The manager smiled. "They don't work for him. They work with him. After dinner, most of the guests stayed behind to congratulate me. Several exchanged business cards. One even asked about investing in my next restaurant. My father quietly waited near the entrance. As the last guests left, he walked over. "I owe you an apology." I looked at him but said nothing. "I spent years judging success by titles. And I judged you without asking what kind of man you'd become." I smiled gently. "You weren't wrong that I waited tables. I just never told you they were my own." For the first time in years, my father laughed, this time at himself. "I'm proud of you." I appreciated the words. But what mattered more was that he had finally learned something. A month later, he returned to the restaurant with no guests, no audience, and no speeches. He simply ordered dinner. When I came to greet him, he stood up, shook my hand, and said, "Thank you, for teaching me that no honest job is beneath anyone." Above the entrance of the restaurant hung a small plaque that every employee saw before starting work. "Respect isn't earned by the chair you sit in, but by how you treat the people standing beside you." It was the same principle on which I had built the business. And in the end, it was worth far more than any title my father had ever admired.